It is no secret that anime and cyberpunk, like birds of a feather, often flock together. From old classics of the 80s and 90s, like Akira and Ghost in the Shell, both drawing heavily from foundational cyberpunk stories like Neuromancer or Do Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, to more recent works like Cyberpunk Edge Runners, working themselves off works inspired by them in a weird aesthetic Ouroboros of neon, data, and alienation. But for me, one series stands out, both in the excellence of its world building, the splendor of its story and characters, and the sheer density of its themes. One that I, to my now absolute disbelief, slept on for years. That series is Psycho Pass. After watching the first season, I was hooked, and I tore through the rest of the franchise over the course of a couple of weeks. And I can honestly say it has my absolute recommendation for anyone who even vaguely likes cyberpunk, police procedurals, or stories that leave you staring at the ceiling at 2 AM, questioning the structure of our society. And what kind of slightly autistic white guy in his late 20s would I be if I didn't now proceed making a video essay about my latest hyperfixation? And don't worry if you're concerned about spoilers. There will be some, but only minor ones for the actual story. We'll be focusing less on the plot itself, but once again on the world building and logic of the setting, and one particular notion that I couldn't escape while watching, one that I haven't seen discussed so far online yet. So, without any further ado, let's dive right into the twilight future of the 22nd century. The series' first season begins in the cyberpunk future of the distant year 2116. As per usual for the genre, the world we see is one of strife and unrest. Especially Asia seems beset by regional conflicts and general social breakdown, though the magnitude of crisis varies, and there's one notable exception. Largely isolated and autonomous, the nation of Japan stands out in this unruly world, a peaceful paradise all watched over by machines of loving grace. Its citizens no longer have to worry about finding work. Occupations befitting their profile are forwarded to them upon graduation. When it comes to finding a partner, psychological matchmaking is offered, and not only can be detected whether someone committed a crime, but better yet, is likely to do so. All these social issues of the past are supposedly solved by the enigmatic Sybil system, a marvel of modern technology, by whose calculations the people will be guided towards the path that will guarantee them the most happiness. We mostly see this brave new world through the eyes of its agents inside the Ministry of Health and Welfare, one of the ministries governing Japan, and likely the most powerful of them, and, more precisely, its Public Safety Bureau's Criminal Investigation Department. And while systems that solve crime via psychological metrics aren't uncommon in fiction, Psycho Pass is unusual for how much thought it devotes to the logic and consequences of that system. Put simply, via a technology called cymatic scans, a person's mental state and personality can be measured and quantified in the form of the titular psychopath, which every citizen carries and whose corresponding color can be read at a glance. Managing one's psychopath is vital, as it affects job opportunities, continued employment, and social standing. Though help is available, be it mental care, counseling, or medication, and the numerous street scanners detecting a change for the worse will direct you towards treatment. But what about the people who reject the advances of this therapeutic state, are judged beyond help, or still would break its laws? Alongside the psychopath's hue exists the crime coefficient, by which the populace is categorized. Citizens who remain at a score of under 100 enjoy public life as it is, while those over are deemed latent criminals and will be institutionalized until recovery, or indefinitely. Finally, those who reach a score of 300 and over are classified as threats to society and may be pursued with lethal force. We meet this system on the job as we join our protagonist, the young Inspector Akane Sonomori, on her first day in the Criminal Investigation Department's first division. With her is the Senior Inspector Genosa, the team's analyst Shion, and the enforcers. Latent criminals who the Bureau employs for the dirty work, so that the inspectors leading the cases don't cloud their mind and psychopaths with the grisly details. Serving this role are the brooding Kogami, the feisty Kagari, the quiet Yayoi, and the old veteran Masaoka, himself a former detective that had trouble adapting to the new standards of criminal investigation and handing out Sybil's judgment. The latter not being any exaggeration, as the powerful weapon wielded by them and the inspectors, the portable psychological diagnosis and suppression system, or simply the Dominator, not only is able to read a target's crime coefficient, but alongside the earlier mentioned thresholds will either lock the trigger, administer a non-lethal paralyzing shot, or switch into the lethal eliminator mode that will just completely annihilate anyone beyond mercy. We follow them as they unravel a set of crimes, possibly connected to an old case gone cold, in an exciting cyberpunk detective story. And of course, as you'd expect, they must confront not just criminals, but the system itself and its imperfections. It seems to work well on the surface. Crime is low, public life orderly, and many of the criminals we see detected via these methods are, while seldom one-dimensional villains, indeed utterly depraved. Something that the show does not shy away from showing, I perhaps should add to my recommendation. But not only does the crime coefficient seem to sometimes produce what we would call false positives, the Sybil system itself hasn't come without its fair bit of side effects for society at large. And what is justice in a world where its scales are no longer held by human hands? This is only one of the many issues the show addresses, with later entries even delving into different genres, sometimes to the point of being a bit all over the place. But I suppose it's not unusual in the cyberpunk genre to center on one core technological premise or hypothetical scenario, and then build the rest of the world from there. Rather unsurprisingly, then, many reviews and essays about the show interrogate themes such as its critique of utilitarianism, questions of mental health and free will, the difficult balance between freedom and security, and all of that with good reason. But watching the show, episode by episode, from enforcement actions and investigative procedure to calmer moments of mundane life and philosophical reflections, I couldn't escape another association, one that I haven't seen covered at all yet. For as I watched closely, not just what was done for or by the system, but how so, and not just who, but what kind of people were serving and produced by it, I was reminded of another book that would line itself neatly among the many others mentioned in the show. For which, once again, we need to take a trip down academic theory lane to The Future Envisioned by James Burnham. To keep the biography brief this time, James Burnham was an American political theorist and influential public intellectual best known for his analysis of modern power structures. Born in 1905 in Chicago as the son of an English immigrant, he graduated with distinction from Princeton before attending Oxford. There he did such fun things as studying English and medieval philosophy under professors such as a certain J.R.R. Tolkien, perhaps better known for his other work. In 1929, Burnham became a professor of philosophy at New York University. During the following decade, he was involved in socialist politics, particularly within the Trotskyist movement, and he even maintained a correspondence with Diod Leon. Over time, however, disagreements grew, and Burnham became increasingly critical of his former beliefs. In 1940, he finally broke with communism and Trotsky, a couple of months before Comrade Stalin sent a man to the ladder with an ice pick and his regards. Those political and theoretical disagreements were no doubt partly fueled by and fed into the ideas that Burnham himself was beginning to develop, and that he laid out fully in his most famous work, The Managerial Revolution. So, what is it all about? To start simple, one notion common in a lot of social or political science is that to understand a society or a system, one must understand who governs it, and vice versa. And for that, there have been various ideas on how to differentiate and analyze different types of ruling classes and how they govern. For example, you could differentiate between the warrior elites of nobility or more priestly clergy of old, and the merchants and capital classes that later rose to dominance. Or you go with Machiavelli, who used this model of lions and foxes to distinguish between different types of rulers. And then, of course, there's also the Marxist story. From feudalism to capitalism, then the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, and with it, the revolution. Finally, the supposed victory of socialism and communism. This is the path that James Burnham himself initially came from, and in his book he set out to challenge it. For while he was still doubtful of capitalism lasting in its classical form, he also no longer believed that socialism in the Marxist sense was inevitable, or that it would be the proletariat that would supersede the old capital. Instead, he argued that a new ruling class was emerging, the class of the managers. Those whose talents had become indispensable in a world of unprecedented mass and scale. Bureaucrats and technical experts, executives and administrators, people who control information, planning, coordination, and decision-making. Crucially, unlike the old capitalists, these managers do not necessarily own the means of production or the land they govern. Their power comes from running organizations, be they corporations, state agencies, or militaries. And thus they claim their legitimacy not from divine right, inherited status, or even property, but from their supposed expertise, rational planning, and measurable efficiency. Burnham also noted that this transition would not happen peacefully, at least not entirely, as it produced conflicts between old elites and new administrators, an ideological shift towards technocratic justifications, and political systems that can look harsh, ideological, and totalizing in their early phases before stabilizing into routinized bureaucratic orders. His primary examples for this transformation were the great powers of the time, the United States, the Soviet Union, and National Socialist Germany. In Burnham's view, the latter two represented more overt, hard, and brutal expressions of managerial rule, where the new class fused itself directly with the state apparatus. The United States, by contrast, showed a softer and more dispersed form, where managers rose through corporations, regulatory bodies, and administrative agencies rather than a single-party state, but the underlying shift in who actually exercised power was, in his eyes, all too similar. And alongside this shift comes something else: the growth of large-scale administration, expanding bureaucracies, and welfare and social service systems, as seen in all three of the examples in some manner. Not necessarily so because the people in charge or the rising managers themselves were altruists, but because the very scale of modern society requires constant supervision, coordination, and maintenance. And every new layer of organization, regulation, and service creates further demand for the managerial skills that justify their position. Although that doesn't mean that all managers are heartless cutthroats by nature. Burnham wasn't writing a morality play. When it comes to the managers as individuals, it may be capitalism, socialism, or fascism they serve under, and they themselves might be true believers, cynical opportunists, or anything in between, really. But insofar we look at them as a class, incentives matter more than ideology. And thus, it doesn't really matter if it's the military, academia, healthcare, or social services, or if they're acting out of benevolent, ulterior, or malicious motives. What matters is that the size and complexity of the systems around them, and thus the demand for the talents the managers offer, increases, and with it, the influence within them. The managers, in that sense, are very adaptable creatures. As long as they can operate in their natural habitat, the world of numbers, reports, spreadsheets, metrics, and regulations, they can thrive under very different ideological banners. Or, to put it in more dramatic terms, whether they are counting production quotas, administered benefits, or bodies of dissidents, whether one death or a million, what matters is that it is a manageable statistic. Not to say that all of this was just some grand old conspiracy of the managers to take power, or that their skills are not generally necessary. Bureaucracy, logistics, and administrative records have existed from the days of the ancient linear B tablets tracking grain storage to reports about the exploits of certain infamous copper merchants, and they will likely always exist in some form. But it seems that indeed at no other point in history before, after truly emerging as a ruling class of its own, did the managerial class have such a strong grip on the world as in our modern time. Something that, for better or worse, without a doubt still holds true over 80 years later. And so it seems worthwhile to ponder how a world would look like in which that process has continued even further beyond. Where management systems no longer merely administer society and its people, but define them. In which minute details of everyday life can be regulated, optimized, monitored, and corrected by an apparatus that claims scientific legitimacy for doing so. And where everyone can rely on the guidance of a powerful algorithm backed by supporting data for their decisions. Let's say about another 80 years over from now. Well, we certainly wouldn't feel it as entirely unfamiliar if we now return to the twisted world of the 22nd century that we see envisioned in Psychopaths, and what glimpses of such a world it offers. Now, I'm not claiming that the writers of Psychopaths consciously set out to create a story about managerialism, or that James Burnham offers the single most fitting set of Western ideas through which to compare to. There are other works that would fit just as well, or even better, and deserve an analysis of their own. And depending on how this one does, perhaps their own video. So don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more of this type of content in the future. And while it would be a welcome one, it would be a surprise to me to hear that any of the writers have even read the Managerial Revolution. At least with the esteemed Earl Butcher, my money would be on a different well-known American author. Not to say that he or the other writers haven't done their fair bit of reading. Watching the series, it's pleasantly obvious that they have, and so have quite a few of the characters. After all, this is a world where random chromed-up mercenaries hanging out in Southeast Asian war zones will casually quote Frantz Fanon at you, but will not burn him directly. From what I could gather, his ideas did have some influence on economic discourse in post-war Japan. For example, in Banjo Otsuka's modified capitalism proposal, but they never gained broad public recognition. And it doesn't even have to be the case for what Burnham proposed. As he himself readily admits in the first chapter, that not only was he not the first one to come up with these ideas, but he began writing the book partly because whenever he spoke about them, so many people instantly recognized the patterns he described. Similarly, whether they know Burnham or not, it would be highly unlikely that Japanese society at large, or the writers of Psychopaths for that matter, are blind to the issues his work addressed, and which seem ever present in our modern world. The show itself practically screams this at you, and more than once, the Sybil system is referred to as the ultimate bureaucracy. So, let's approach its world through that lens. Not because it's the only valid interpretation, of course, but because it is one that, as we'll see, fits remarkably well. The beginnings of this world lie in what for us is still the near future. In the series, the 2020s and 2030s are remembered as a period of cascading global crisis. From economic collapse and mass unemployment to widespread social instability and escalation of regional conflicts, leading to the breakdown of the old world order. Japan's response was a policy of self-sufficiency, isolation, and promoting the rising technology of cymatic scans as a tool to efficiently allocate labor, fix unemployment, and stabilize the country after the end of the neoliberal economy. For that purpose, an advanced supercomputer with the necessary processing power was developed. This was the birth of Sybil, and with its success, its domain expanded, from employment to education, from mental health to law enforcement, and finally the echelons of government themselves. And with its rise, more and more agencies were reorganized into the fold of its administrators, the Ministry of Health and Welfare. All this hitting on three major points by which Burnham defines the social revolution: drastic changes in the social and economic institutions, parallel ones in culture and ideology, and lastly, a shift in the ruling class. Now, one could quibble about the third point. We're never given exact details, but Japan still is a parliament with members and governors voted for by the populace. Though, as Burnham notes, this shift doesn't have to result in a complete replacement of the former elite. Usually, some of them will try to integrate into the new order. And in the show, some people make the not unreasonable claim that as these electives are pre-selected by Sybil and largely serve as functionaries, that Japan no longer is a real democracy. On the other hand, despite the system's dark implications, we are also not presented with a relentlessly brutal dictatorship either. Things seem much closer to what Burnham and later critics would describe as a mature managerial society. One not defined by overt repression and visible force, but by pervasive and sometimes ruthless administration that leaves very little outside its reach. Whether now we call this governance by algorithm or, following my reading, techno-futuristic utilitarian hypermanagerialism, I guess, as far as its human layer of administrators is concerned, while not a perfect fit, they generally echo Burnham's managerial class. Another common critique of managerial elites would be also that as they derive their legitimacy not from ownership or risk-bearing, but expertise, neutrality, and system optimization, they tend to lack personal experience and responsibility. They have no skin in the game, so to speak, which could also be said for the Sybil system and its advocates, who regularly pride themselves on its detached objectivity as flawed human judgment itself has been outsourced to a data-driven alternative. So, what other managerial influence do we see in other aspects of the society shown? While not ignoring the topic, the show doesn't delve in detail into how the economy works, but it seems to be similarly bureaucratized and micromanaged as the rest of the setting. Yet as this extends to Sybil and the domain of the Ministry of Welfare, the managerial influence can be once again felt even stronger. While homelessness exists in a few desolate areas, there also seems to be a somewhat livable welfare system around. There are still distinctions between the rich and poor, and it seems not unreasonable to assume that they extend to the ease with which one's own psychopath is managed. For this, though, a wide range of mental treatments are available, from mental care drones deployed in massive events to professional counseling and medications that we see advertised. And even more so, there doesn't seem to be much trouble in affording the latter, to the point of abuse in some cases. Nor does there seem to be any other lack of mental care services, or is any great financial or other difficulty ever mentioned in acquiring them. Similarly, while the mental care facilities incarcerating the latent criminals are beasts of their own, administratively speaking, transfer to them seems to also go without any trouble. My assumption watching the show was that many of these services must be either partly or largely funded by the Ministry of Welfare, which well would fit the name. Admittedly, it is a bit of guesswork on my part, but it would line up well with the nature of the dystopian themes presented. Not being able to get mental health services is not the problem, but instead not being able to get away from them. And from what I could gather from sources besides the show, such as some guidebooks, these seem to back me up on this notion. A larger welfare state, needing the proper technocratic expertise and administration, just as the managers preferred, as they are not only the driving force, but primary beneficiaries of its expansion, as a source of power for them and source of others' dependence on them. But I probably don't even need to go that far. Quite frankly, the most simple and prudent question, especially having watched the show, would be to just ask if the Sybil system and its agents seem to be the types to leave that vital area of their perfect society completely to the whims of the free market, or better said, outside their control. And the answer is rather easy. Under the therapeutic state that is Sybil's Japan, you will get your affordable mental health care. Or else. And not only education, employment, and public life in general shaped by Sybil, but both the fine arts and popular culture don't fully escape its grasp either. Creative expression, like everything else, is evaluated through the metric of psychological impact. Restrictions and regulations are in place, as both art and media that risk clouding the psychopaths of others and artists that have become so devoted to their craft that their heroes suffered for it fall under heavy scrutiny, and the latter will be institutionalized as latent criminals if their crime coefficient demands it. And in their opposition, art and artists officially authorized by Sybil are mentioned in the show. Still, there seems to be a large gray area in between, as non-authorized artists are still around. I also got the impression that the system, ever cold and managerial, cares less about the art itself but its measurable effects, as it lets some artists who became latent criminals continue to indulge in art, as long as they, and likely it, doesn't leave their petted cells. And while art and censorship are discussed in the show, we don't see how exactly it is enforced. And from what is shown, it's likely more so a matter of preemptive filtering, incentive for artists to censor themselves, and authorized ones given preferential treatment and attention, which wouldn't be unfitting for the managerial types. After all, what need is there to burn books if the people never even heard of them? Similarly, while we see instances of press suppression and information control, the sprawling holo network culture and internet in general offer at least a little retreat from Sybil's looming shadow. Now, don't get me wrong. Let's not miss the iron fist for the velvet glove it's dressed in, but also not ignore the nuance when the system is choosing to act with one instead of the other. Why enforce compliance where consent can be manufactured? Following Burnham, more mature and softer managerial systems prefer legitimacy and technocratic authority over visible coercion whenever possible, the rule of laws to the rule of force. This is the language we hear from Sybil and its representatives, appeals to expert consensus and recommendation of approved channels, the tone of procedure and professionalism, rather patronizing than outright oppressive. Whether you think the world Sybil is building a utopia or a dystopia, it is one that runs on safety wheels and guardrails. But talking about this brave new world, what such people has it in it? The average citizen rests easy on the sunny side of the darker aspects of the utilitarianism the show draws on. Does the bliss of the many outweigh the plight of the few? Well, there are many that live in a peace and comfort probably never seen before in human history. This is the promise offered by Sybil, providing the most happiness for the most people. It surely has a nice ring to it for those that are the most, and less so for the others. And we might rightfully call this unjust. But that is not my point here. Think about what most people are like. Misanthrope or philanthrope, you will likely agree that their happiness lies mostly in the immediate and simple, family and friends, stability and some modest comforts. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but taking that train of thought further, this means in practice that whoever wants to bring it about will find themselves biased towards the most easily satisfied, optimizing for the median and smoothing out any extremes. This is Sybil's world, a near-perfect paradise for those neither great or terrible, but with little room for those striving towards something greater, be it driven by virtue or depravity, where human excellence and transcendence bow to risk assessments. The population we see is in many ways peaceful, but tamed. Violence is so rare that many seem overwhelmed when having to confront it, to the point that this has become a stereotype of the Japanese people in other Asian countries. Some even fall victim to the rather particular condition called eustress deficiency, which renders them catatonic, not from stress they suffer, but the lack of it. A peaceful and happy society for most, to the point that some drift into a blissful slumber, or a defanged but well-fed herd, with the few untamed ones battering themselves raw against their cage. In any case, a set of units most easily managed. This, of course, doesn't have to be an accident. The managerial class rules not by owning, but administrating, and this quite likes dependence and uniformity. They want to be wanted and need to be needed. Still, we should remember our earlier notion. While Sybil and its agents will use violence when necessary, there are other marks of the softer managerial variant seen in the show. Two common criticisms of the managerial way, often brought forth in modern debates on the topic, come to mind in particular. The first is simple. For all their technical aptitude, the managers are said to lack a certain practical sense. Sometimes their projects will have overlooked side effects that are difficult to contain once the slow but mighty wheels of bureaucracy move. For example, think of the large-scale agricultural subventions for dairy and corn that led to market distortions and monocultures following FDR's New Deal, in which Burnham fittingly saw the first steps of the Managerial Revolution in America. Not only is the show an agriculture equivalent of extreme monoculture farming in form of the hyper-oats from which most food is derived, one could also argue if the false positives of the crime coefficient and the social malaise of eustress deficiency are results of the system working as intended or blinded by its own data. The second is particularly addressed at the softer managers, who are said to not handle violence all that well, both when confronting it or using it themselves. The former, of course, is a nuisance to the smooth operation of their myriad systems, and as for the latter, they lack both the proficiency and personality for it and prefer technical solutions when possible. But once their hand is forced, they usually tend to either doing too little and too late, or overcorrect with a show force way beyond what would have been necessary. Remind you that the Dominator jumps from paralyzing people to a grisly reminder on why you shouldn't put watermelons in the microwave. Particularly the second point could be easily read into the show as well, if we now look from overall politics and daily life at the way of Sybil's judgment and those who have to bear and carry out the sentence. But at this point I likely won't have to explain how the very idea of a psychopath and crime coefficient can be easily seen as managerial-made horrors not at all beyond comprehension. It's still worth taking a closer look. The show doesn't go in minute detail on how exactly cymatic scans work, or every metric by which the crime coefficient is calculated, and wisely so I think. There's no need to over-explain it here. It is important that they work, not so much how exactly. But of course, it's still fun to speculate, if you allow me this slight side tangent. From what is shown and mentioned in the show, stress level and violent impulse are important metrics, and seemingly a general criminal aptitude in one's overall mental state, but that doesn't seem to be the full set of factors Sybil is using. And as said before, it's not that this doesn't work. It's probably correct on most people who would never or absolutely at some point will become a threat to society. But in Sybil's cold and rigid calculations, a good number of good people are caught in between. From what I've seen online, tendencies or behaviors that could negatively impact the hue of other people, called psychohazards in the show, or actions that might otherwise raise the area's stress level are likely factors that especially contribute towards what we would deem false positives. Following this, while being a particularly dark example of Sybil's utilitarian ethics, this could possibly be an explanation on why traumatized victims are sometimes flagged as latent criminals or worse. Something that I myself kept thinking on was if the semantic scans don't differentiate which way potentially dangerous behavior would be directed. While no mention of outright self-harm, one enforcer seen in later seasons is mentioned to have a history of depression and substance abuse. And as beloved as many of the enforcers are, would never get themselves into trouble isn't exactly the way you would describe most of them. Looking at the memorable example of the traumatized woman seen in the first episode, if one tries to understand Sybil's mysterious ways, it is worth mentioning that she sat in a puddle of gasoline with a lighter in her hand. Not only could this lead to great harm to herself and perhaps the members of Division 1, but to lead back to the aforementioned factors on a rather dark and Kafkaesque path, if she set herself aflame, that would be bound to negatively impact the psychopaths of anyone unfortunate enough to see and hear it, and by that, the area stress level. But that is speculation on my part, and while we might theorize about the twisted utilitarian reasoning behind it, we shouldn't look away from the harsh realities created by it, and their rather managerial outlook. Good or bad, what matters to those ruling by metrics is that outcomes are measurable and any moral culpabilities are to be addressed insofar as they can be integrated into the workflows executed. What matters is that the key task at hand is addressed quickly, reliably, and with minimal disturbance to aggregate issues. This line of thinking also extends to how the civil system and the Ministry of Welfare treat those who have fallen out of their good graces. For while latent criminals and enforcers are ostracized by wider society and faced more outright discrimination back when the crime coefficient was first introduced, the system's treatment of them is a different beast. Particularly from what we see in the first season of Psychopaths, while they are second-class citizens no doubt, they aren't exactly treated as slaves or overtly abused. While held on a leash, the enforcers live with a fair bit of comfort. And the drones and staff at mental health facilities act not unfriendly, but rather firm and clinical towards those imprisoned there. That likely doesn't make it any better from our moral standpoint, but I think this nuance is worth pointing out. In a way, they're not even given the dignity of earnest hate or ruthless oppression. The system neither acknowledges their humanity nor openly admits to its denial. What they constantly face, more so than any normal citizens, is being managed. While in the facilities, they're treated and provided for. But what they love can be taken away at any moment by others, driven not by malice, but by protocol. They not so much suffer abuse by individuals or any built-in terror, but rather just the system itself being ruthlessly inflicted upon them. Not only does this once again play into the softer managerial side I mentioned, it is also reminiscent of another major criticism raised against them in particular. While rather handy at monitoring and containing problems, they are said to lack the ability, or more cynically, the incentive to truly solve them. After all, if the problems were solved, there would be no further need for their services. And while it is difficult to say whether the latter applies here, its practical consequences are certainly felt by the latent criminals. Watching the show, it really was my impression that to Sybil and most of its agents, the average latent criminal is neither an object of hatred nor of pity, but rather an objective at best. Not a human to be healed, not a monster to be hunted, but just a task to be processed, a problem to be managed. A facility cell number waiting to be assigned, and a list of medications waiting to be filled out. They, and for that matter even many of the actual perpetrators, are treated with neither fiery zeal nor redemptive intent, but with cold professionalism. And why wouldn't it be so? After all, you don't need to hate them, you don't need to pity them, You don't even need to think about them. You just have to do your job. Point the gun, wait for the command, and when it tells you, pull the trigger. Yet when it comes to those carrying out Sybil's judgment, the inspectors and enforcers, one of the first things that stand out about the work of the former is how technical and procedural it is. Much of the investigative process is not carried out through legwork or intuition, but through systems, drone scanning environments, automated forensic tools, vast databases, and constant data analysis provided through Sybil infrastructure. The role of the human detective becomes less about personally discovering clues and more about managing the flow of information, collecting, verifying, and analyzing the results produced by the system. In that sense, the inspector echo Burnham's managerial types. Their job is not primarily to act, but to supervise processes, coordinate resources, and make decisions based on institutional data. The grisly and gritty details, however, and the eventual execution are, at least ideally, left to the enforcers, and their use for Sybil and the system does not end there. A good example appears in an early investigation. Our inspectors are puzzled about how a victim's body could have disappeared from his apartment without a trace. It is the enforcer Kogami who bluntly suggests that the victim was probably hacked into pieces, dissolved, and then disposed of through the drainage system. He's quickly proven right, but you could argue that so is his crime coefficient, as this of course is not exactly the first idea most normal people would arrive at. And the show repeatedly implies that to catch a criminal, one must be able to think like one. But while this mindset enables someone to stop a crime, it also implies the ability to commit one. And so it is something that the Sybil system seeks to keep outside polite society, while being perfectly happy to make use of it through the enforcers. Hypocrisy, perhaps, but not something unknown to managerial systems. As much as they insist on rules, they can and will bend them when expediency demands it. The rules exist to organize the system, but the system comes first. Carl Schmitt and the Sovereign's exception send their regards. And this not without reason. As we see repeatedly, while the inspectors' technical methods are effective, they sometimes reach their limits, particularly when confronted with the most wicked criminals under the neon skies of the future. As mentioned before, managerial types are often said to lack a certain practical aptitude. They are better at gathering data and analyzing situations than spearheading solutions. In this context, while the inspectors are called detectives and function as the equivalent of criminal investigators, it is worth remembering where they come from. They are employees of the Ministry of Health and Welfare, and you could say that thus their authority derives not just from traditional policing institutions, but just as much from an administrative branch dedicated to maintaining the population's psychological well-being. Put simply, we could and perhaps should think of the inspectors also as healthcare inspectors. Mental healthcare inspectors, that is. Once armed and licensed to detain or eliminate any citizen falling short of governmentally assigned standards. Not only another glimpse of the looming managerial shadow, but if nothing else, pretty much peak cyberpunk. And this managerial dynamic does not stop with criminal procedure, but extends into the surrounding interactions with the rest of society, particularly its institutions. While Psychopath does not spend much time exploring the exact machinery of high politics, preferring instead to stay grounded where everyday life under Sybil is felt most directly, the series still offers several hints that are worth exploring. It may be partly due to the procedural nature of the show, but whenever employees of different ministries interact, the encounters rarely pass without some degree of bureaucratic friction. This is, of course, an issue as old as administration itself, but it's also something that James Burnham specifically noted when describing managerial systems. As power shifts from individuals to organizations, authority increasingly flows through overlapping bureaucratic hierarchies, each defending its own jurisdiction, procedures, and informational domain. Especially during the investigations of the Public Safety Bureau, we see such tensions play out. They are all rather protective of their jurisdiction and own internal affairs, and will not hesitate to pull rank or invoke regulations to keep the PSB out of their business. And it is not at all uncommon for managerial societies to produce exactly this pattern. Large administrative institutions competing with one another, not only for resources, but also for authority. In such systems, conflicts rarely take the form of open ideological struggle. Instead, they manifest as procedural disputes, questions of oversight, responsibility, and departmental competence. And as we see in the show, this friction is not necessarily driven by personal malice. Most of the time, it is simply the product of officials acting in what they perceive to be the rational interest of their department. Anything that might tarnish the record of their office or threaten the numbers and quota by which their performance is judged is quietly resisted, even if it obstructs the pursuit of justice. The managers are not necessarily immoral people per se, but their moral horizon tends to run up against the logic of administration, efficiency, stability, and measurable outcomes. One could even ask what utilitarianism aiming for the greatest happiness of the greatest number, which has so strongly shaped this world, even is in practice, if not the idealism of the bottom line. And for my final but again a bit speculative point, especially at higher levels of governance, we can even see something that resembles Burnham's idea of managerial encroachment on other elite groups and the conflicts that rise from it. While we not see many conflicts within the ministries in the series, especially in the later entries, we can make out glimpses of the lines drawn between them. The Ministry of Welfare, tied at the hip as it is with the Sybil system, appears to be one of the most powerful players in Japan's internal politics, but there are other factions around. In particular, the Ministries of Economy, Defense, and Foreign Affairs seem prone to clash with them to varying degrees and pursue their own projects. And they aren't happy at all whenever they feel the Ministry of Welfare and with it Sybil's grasp encroaching upon their domains, as they have seen how the Great Oracle has completely reshaped their country over the last decades. These tensions are not out of line with Burnham's predictions, especially regarding the economic and military sectors, quite the opposite actually. In the first case, this is not to say that the economic sphere represents distant echoes of the old bourgeoisie that the managers superseded. As said, they seem to be just as bureaucratized as the rest. And while the show doesn't go into enough detail to discuss this point at length, what we do see indicates a heavily automated, state-controlled or mixed economy, very much in line with Burnham's vision. Of course, the managerial class, while sharing certain incentives, or perhaps exactly because of doing so, are not immune to internal conflicts. They all like to expand their systems and thereby solidify their claim to power, but easily clash once they begin competing for funding among themselves. One could also make the point that other ministries, while managerial themselves, are not tied as closely to Sybil as welfare is, nor ideologically at its particular level of hyper-technocratic thinking. In fact, even abandoned rival projects to Sybil are mentioned in the series. And as for the second case, the military sector, as is brought forth in many modern debates, can become a source of conflict for softer managers, as it has the potential to become a distinct elite with the capacity to constrain or contest their rule. As said before, while not a hard rule, softer managers do not exactly like using brute force, and are especially wary of those who are better at using it than themselves. Not that cooperation between them is impossible, but as a tendency, softer managerial types and classical military types are wary of each other, and as seen in Psychopaths, rightfully so on the latter's part as well. As far as Sybil's Japan is concerned, while the military is still around, the introduction of the Psychopaths did not come without trouble on their end. And the traditional army man seems to have fallen somewhat to the wayside, with various types of military drones increasingly becoming the backbone of armed conflicts. But even here, one could again raise the point that the representatives of both groups seen in this story at this point aren't exactly visionary captains of industry or brave generals and warriors of old, but in many ways just older, and perhaps harder, manager types, earlier products of the Managerial Revolution. But then again, what is said about revolutions if not that they eat their own children? Rather, they do not seem entirely without reason when they direct their anger at those they see as nothing but the slaves of dreaded Sybil. Ever expanding and moderating, managing and optimizing, it seems that even as people fight and struggle against it, the ultimate bureaucracy will adapt, learn and evolve. And one wonders what strange sights it will offer as it marches onward into a world beyond the Managerial Revolution. A world laid out by James Burnham nearly 90 years ago and shown in Psychopaths set a mere 90 years from now. And what more fitting way to end a video about Psychopaths than to present a literary quote, so let me read a slightly shortened excerpt from his closing words. If most people did indeed want peace, plenty and freedom from all forms of exploitation and tyranny, and if they also knew the means whereby these were to be got, and if they were willing and courageous and strong and intelligent and self-sacrificing enough to bring about those means to those ends, then no doubt the world would achieve a society organized in such a way as to realize peace, plenty and freedom. But there is not any evidence at all from past or present history that all three of these conditions will be met. On the contrary, the evidence of the analogies from the past and the circumstances of the present is that people will act and wish and hope and decide in ways that will aid in the Managerial Revolution, in the carrying through of the social transition which will end in the consolidation of managerial society. When we deal with the problems of history, we usually misread them in terms of what we hope instead of understanding them as the evidence dictates. And I suspect that most objections to the theory of the Managerial Revolution will be found to rest on hopes, not on evidence. There will be those who will find in this a renewed proof of what they will call the essential tragedy of the human situation. But I do not see with what meaning the human situation as a whole can be called tragic or comic. Tragedy and comedy occur only within the human situation. There is no background against which to judge the human situation as a whole. It is merely what it happens to be.